Well, good evening. We're happy to have you. We're back and going to do one more session here before I disappear for a few weeks and go to the Senior Soaring Championships down in Florida. Um, and then I just want to mention right now that at the end of the this program, I've got a schedule up. I'll put a schedule up. Basically, I'll run a class the last Wednesday in March, and then all the Wednesdays in April. So it'll be 5 Wednesdays in April. And that'll kind of conclude this season of webinars. And we're going to try to do something beyond that, but I haven't really decided for sure. So you can look at that schedule at the end of this session when we talk about that. So welcome to Chapter 10, the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, Teaching Practical Risk Management During Flight Instruction. This is kind of an often overlooked chapter in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, and so it's worthwhile to go through and look at it. So in the panel tonight, we got Rich Carlson, our chairman, Bert Compton, a trustee of the Soaring Safety Foundation, Ken Sorensen, a regional director and flight instructor. Bob Wonder is on a train, I guess, traveling between. Where did you say, Rich? He was traveling between, but he's not going to be available tonight. I'm Ron Ridenour, FA DPE, along with Bert Compton and Soaring Safety Foundation trustee. Question and answers are available during the webinar. I cannot see your questions, but the other panel members can, and we'll either answer your questions or we'll pose them to me and the rest of the group during a break in the webinar. So please write in your comments, especially when we get down to the scenarios section. I'm going to want as many people who want to try to talk about the scenario. Please write your answers in there, and then the panel members can see them and convey them to all the rest of us. So topics to be discussed tonight: risk management and accident causality, risk management teaching test techniques by phase of instruction, managing risks during flight instruction, and using the PAVE checklist. So we're going to emphasize the use of the PAVE checklist tonight, as we do in the flight instructor refresher courses that the Soaring Safety Foundation teaches. It's a good tool that we can use to not only assess our risks before a flight, but it also helps us to assess some scenarios as to what the risks are in that scenario. So we'll be using that tonight in several scenarios that we'll have later in the session here. So the Aviation Instructor's Handbook starts off page 10-2, proper risk management. We use a risk analysis using the PAVE checklist. I hope that most of you are, if not all, are aware of what the PAVE checklist is. Stands for pilots, aircraft, environment. It's actually the V in environment, and that should be capitalized just to emphasize that. And then external pressures. So we'll be, like I said, we'll be using this PAVE checklist to analyze some of the scenarios that we will present during this session. So when to teach risk management skills? Well, you should try teaching them right away. I mean, early in the instruction. I mean, don't hold back, and don't make it a mystery or anything like that. Try to incorporate risk management type of tools that we'll talk about right from the very beginning of any instruction. And you don't have to necessarily introduce it as risk management, but you should be introducing it to your students from the beginning. It's important that they understand that risk management is important in our everyday flying. So how to identify a risk, how to assess a risk as to, how much of a risk it is, how to then mitigate that risk. And we use some of these risk management tools. We got the risk assessment matrix. We've showed that to you before in a previous session, and we'll show it to you again in a following session when we reconvene last week of March and into April. And then flight risk assessment tools and personal minimums. We really want to stress that people have personal minimums and that they adhere to them. It's not very good to have a personal minimum, but then just say, oh well, that's for another day. That's not for today. Even though the crosswind's blowing at 15 knots and I only flown in a 10-knot crosswind, I think I'll go fly anyway. So it's try to have some personal minimums and utilize those personal minimums to mitigate the risks that you take when you're flying. So manage risk management by phase of instruction. So we have student pilots, both pre-solo and post-solo. When student pilots are pre-solo, they're kind of they're dependent upon you to help them manage that risk that they're taking, or any risk that they might take. In fact, they're depending on you because you're the one largely making those decisions. You have to slowly transition them, however, as you do the training to a state where they're making the decisions. And I would urge you to do that transition as early in the training. If a student calls you on the phone and says, hey, Bob, the wind's really blowing today. What do you think? And you're the instructor. Well, I would just throw it right back at them and say, well, what do you think? How do you think we should manage the risk of the windy conditions or the low ceilings? So try to make them think, and in that way you can also gain insight as to how they're thinking, and whether the things that you've tried to teach them over the course of instruction has been absorbed, and they're actually thinking about those kinds of the risks that are involved with the strong winds or low visibility or flying in a highly congested area. And so they'll be able to apply those risk management tools and those concepts and ideas in their post-solo flight. Post-solo, they're still under your supervision as an instructor, but you're not there in the cockpit with them when they're actually encounter something that they maybe have never encountered before, or having to make a decision other than what the initial decision that they had made. Whether it's I'm not going to make it back to the field, so I'm going to have to make an off-airport landing, or what the situation may arise for them as they fly solo past the point where they've done their initial solos. Private and commercial pilots is a different phase, and we have transition training. If they're a private or commercial airplane pilot or pilot in another category, and they're transitioning to gliders, well, you want to make sure that you're continuing to push the risk management skills that are necessary to make safe flying. It may be that they learned how to fly 30, 40 years ago, and now they're just reintroducing themselves by training in a glider in a transition training. And 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't talk about risk management the same way that we do in today's. We didn't integrate it into the training as we try to today in today's world. So It's important that you understand your student, especially if they're a rated pilot, not a glider rated pilot, but a rated pilot, and they're transitioning to gliders. It's important that you understand and make sure that they are caught up to speed, so to speak, on the current thinking about how to handle risks and mitigate risks that they might encounter. Also, you're going to be doing recurrent training with either certificated glider pilots or not, with flight reviews or the FAA Wings program. Again, we've mentioned it before in previous webinars, but the FAA Wings program is a really a good program, and it's an ongoing recurrency program, much like the airlines or the or corporate world, military world, use some kind of recurrent training, which is much more robust, in my opinion, than just a flight review every 24 calendar months. So the Wings program is designed to be more of an ongoing recurrent training program, every year, even if a person wants to do it that way. And I would encourage that you have your students do some kind of ongoing recurrent training like that every year. So how do we manage risk during flight instruction? So, there again, you can see the PAVE, and we're going to just talk about it. Pilot risk, familiarity and proficiency. Um, Sometimes pilots aren't as familiar with the aircraft that they're flying as they should be, or not as familiar with the uh, airspace that they're flying in, or not as familiar with the regulations as they should be as far as currency. And then there's also, familiarity with the fact that proficiency is equally, if not more important than currency, because you could be current but not proficient. And that's because you haven't maybe flown as much as you have wanted to. And so you go out and get 3 takeoffs and landings, and now you're current again, but are you really proficient? Another risks that pilots have all to look at is the medical. 6153 dictates that even though we are not required as glider pilots to hold a medical certificate, we still have to evaluate our medical risks, and it's 6153 that requires that. It's not something good to do, the I'm safe checklist or whatever. It's just something that's really good to do. It's in fact required that you assess your medical condition each and every time before you go fly, and that's whether you have a medical certificate or no medical certificate, whether you're required to have one or not required to have one. We have to teach people that they have to evaluate their medical condition every time they want to go fly. Aircraft risks. In general, I think that the glider world, I'm not saying 100%, but the glider world maintains their equipment in pretty good order. However, you still have to have a heads up on maintenance. I remember one time and I may have related this earlier, but I went out and was going to give a check ride in Atlantic, and the flight instructor applicant who I was checking that day said, this glider spins really good to the right, but it doesn't spin hardly at all to the left. And I noticed, in fact, he says, I can't even get it to spin to the left. And so, but I noticed during his pre-flight that when he moved the rudder, it moved probably at least 30 degrees to the right, and it moved maybe 10 degrees to the left. So it was misrigged, which was a maintenance issue. They evidently, I think they had it off over the winter months, and they recovered the rudder, and whoever rigged it didn't rig it properly. And so that can be a maintenance issue, especially if you're knowledgeable about the fact that it was worked on, a piece of the equipment like the rudder or the ailerons or something was recovered or worked on during the winter months, well, you need to pay a little extra attention. Inoperative equipment, it's we're allowed to fly with some inoperative equipment as long as it's placarded and deferred correctly. And 91-213 is what determines how we go about that. And basically, since we don't have an MEL or a minimum equipment list like some aircraft do, we're obliged to look at some different aspects and of whether we can defer those items or not. If we're in a pure glider, 91-205 really doesn't apply to it because 91-205 says powered aircraft. However, if you're in a motor glider, it would apply. So 91-205, if a piece of equipment is required by 91-205, well, then it's not allowed to be made inoperative. The pilot's handbook or operating handbook may require certain pieces of equipment to be operable in order for the aircraft to be airworthy. And so that's another area that you want to check. The type certificate data sheet is another area that you want to check and make sure that it doesn't list a piece of equipment that has to be operative. And lastly, you want to check for AD notes. A good example in the gliding world is the hotelier fittings need to be safetied in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a physical safety pin or some kind of spring-loaded sleeve. Some way, in some ways, after the controls are hooked up, those hotelier fittings have to be safetied so that they won't inadvertently come apart. And when that AD note first came out, I noticed one time when I was flying a glider that had a hotelier fitting and it did not have the pins in it, the safety pins in it. It wasn't required yet, but I can see now why it should have been required. Was later required by an AD because one of those hotelier fittings came apart in flight. And I was shocked. It was the hotelier fitting on the dive brakes, and so I had only dive brakes on one side, not both. And I know they were hooked up, and so after I landed, it really wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of asymmetrical drag, but it really wasn't too bad. After I landed, I hooked it up again, and I worked the spoiler handle, dive brake handle back and forth a few times. And sure enough, that hotelier fitting popped loose again. So it was in need of having that safety pin in there to keep it from coming loose while flying. Another aircraft risk is performance. Do you know that how density altitude affects the performance of your aircraft? And so not only, know that density altitude has an effect, but how does it have an effect? In sailplanes, it has an effect for takeoff because of the tow plane. The engine is not developing as much horsepower. The propeller is not developing as much thrust because it's turning through thinner air. And the wings have to still develop the minimum amount of lift, for the weight of the sailplane or the weight of the airplane that's towing you. So it's not really that it develops less lift, but it has to develop the same amount of lift. And the only way it can do that is to fly at a higher true airspeed. And so as you go up in altitude, the true airspeed increases, which necessitates that it's going to take a longer run for takeoff and also a longer run for landing, because on the landing phase, you have the higher true airspeed, and so therefore your ground speed, in a no-wind condition, your ground speed is going to be equivalent to the true airspeed, which is greater than the indicated airspeed, and so therefore you're going to have a longer ground roll. And if you're in a motor glider, the motor gliders have, um, minimal horsepower, to be quite honest. I've got an Arcus M and it's got 68 horsepower, and that's at basically sea level. And you're losing horsepower in that engine as you go up in altitude too. So the takeoff performance in the motor glider is going to be greatly affected by the density altitude as well because of the engine and propeller performance. Environmental risks. We have, besides, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes about some other environmental risks, but we have crowded airspace around many of the airports that we fly out of. I know that here in the Chicago area, we're right close to the Class Bravo airspace that surrounds Chicago O'Hare. There's a Class Charlie airspace that surrounds Midway. And, those airspaces are crowded. And outside of the Class Bravo or Class Charlie, those airspaces are crowded as well. Just because you're outside of the Class Bravo airspace doesn't mean that the skies don't have a lot of traffic. And in this case, fast moving traffic going at 250 knots. So you really need to have your head on a swivel and eyes looking out all the time, because that crowded airspace can be an environmental type risk. Visibility restrictions, I know the visibility around here in the Chicago area isn't always the greatest. And so again, that reduced visibility increases your risk of a mid-air collision during flight training. So you're in that crowded airspace, you have a reduced visibility. Those are a few of the environmental risks, and like I said, there's others, and we'll discuss them here in a minute. So external pressures. So we have, whether it's a commercial operation or a flight school or a club, we may have scheduling problems. We may have weather issues. People show up with work issues, family issues, finances. They're distracted and have anxiety because of some of those problems with they're preoccupied and distracted. So remember, there's a lot of external pressures. I remember when I had a glider school, and I would get people who would drive out to the glider field during rush hour and arrive, some of them all frazzled from the rush hour traffic, and they didn't learn very well. They were anxious and distracted and thinking about their anxiety of driving in that heavy traffic, and so it just those pressures reduce their ability to have a good training session. So remember, we have those kinds of risks as well during flight instruction. So let's talk about some of the best practices for managing risk during flight instruction. So there again, you'll see the PAVE checklist here. Instructor currency. You, the instructor, need to be current and proficient and medically fit. If you've got a bad cold and especially if you're on some kind of cold medication, you shouldn't be flying. The FAA's recommendation about time to wait after cold medication is 5 times the dosage amount. So if you're allowed to take the medication every 6 hours, in other words, it should be effective for 6 hours, the FAA wants you to wait 5 times those 6 hours, so 30 hours before you contemplate going flying. It's not a rule, it's a recommendation to try to mitigate the risk of having those drugs in your system that might affect your ability to fly the sailplane or make good judgments or just, instruct in general. It's important to have that proficiency too, because, you're going to be demonstrating maneuvers, right? And just because you are current doesn't necessarily mean that you're proficient at demonstrating the maneuvers that you're trying to demonstrate, whether it's steep turns or boxing the wake or stabilized approach and accuracy landing. You want to make sure that you are proficient at the maneuvers that you're going to be teaching while you're doing your instruction during flight instruction. Aircraft airworthiness status. If the aircraft is not airworthy for some reason and you're aware of it, what message are you sending by just saying, "Oh, it'll be okay. Don't worry about that today. I think this is deferrable, but let's not worry about it. Let's get going." Well, if you ignore the rules, if you, the instructor, don't work at and maintain a level of safety that you should, well, your students aren't going to maintain that level of safety either. They're going to just say, "Well, Ron said it was okay, so I'm going to go." And whether it's something that's should be looked at or deferred, or maybe looked at by maintenance and make sure that it's maybe it's not even deferrable. So just keep in mind that the things that you consider when you're doing a pre-flight, or if a student notices something during his or her pre-flight and asks you about it, well, you need to take it seriously and educate your student as to how to handle those situations where a piece of equipment might be inoperative. It's pretty simple. You can put if it's not required, you can put an inoperative sticker on it and log it in a logbook, and now you've taught your student something about how to evaluate and the inoperative piece of equipment, and then you've taught them how to actually defer it legally in accordance with 91-213. So try to be informative and teach how to handle those situations. And environment during instruction. So weather, terrain, airspace, airport configuration, these are all environmental things that we should consider. And when we think about these, if your student is not wanting to fly because the crosswind is higher than their personal limit, or the airspace is that you're flying in today is more congested than you want it to be, or a lot of air glider operations operate on airports that are uncontrolled, and they land the gliders maybe in a grass area next to the runway if you have a regular runway. So how do you handle that situation where you might have an aircraft landing nearly simultaneously with the glider on two different pieces of ground? I know that at least at a few airports, the airport management is very frowns on, having a glider landing right next to an airplane. The airplane's on the hard surface runway and the glider's on the turf runway. And so it just, it's okay to have them land consecutively, in a, orderly fashion, one after the other. But we don't want to be flying parallel approaches, especially if the two runways that we're flying to are not spaced adequately to do that. In the airlines, we fly parallel approaches all the time, but the runways, I don't know exactly what the Terps say as far as how far apart they have to be, but I'm guessing that my recollection is it was something like 3,000 or 4,000 feet spacing between the runways before you could operate in parallel like that. So, and external pressures, how do we manage those external pressures when a person arrives and they're all frazzled, or they're more concerned about the fact they just had an argument with their best friend, or some other external pressure like that's not allowing them to absorb the instruction that you're trying to give them. So, you have to be aware of those things and And if the person seems to be distracted or something, well, maybe today's not the best day to go fly. Maybe do a little ground instruction or something like that. Because if they're distracted on the ground by some external pressure, they're going to be definitely distracted in the air as well. So,
Ron,
yes,
before you go on, you might want to touch on the currency issues for instructors, the recent change.
the currency issues for instructors.
6157.
Yeah, 6157, right. So, instructors kind of in the past have thought that when they're piloting command, even though they're not operating the controls, that counts to maintain their currency. And the FAA's recently come out with a ruling on that that basically says that's not true. In order to maintain your currency, you have to be the sole manipulator of the controls. And that's what the regulations have always said, but it's been kind of misinterpreted, I guess, and blended in with being the pilot in command. Like if you have a student pilot with you, well, you're the pilot in command. But if they're the sole manipulator of the controls during the flight instruction period, then you're not maintaining your currency that you maintain. So the recent interpretation is that as a flight instructor, you have to be the sole manipulator of the controls every 90 days of a sailplane. It doesn't matter what sailplane it is, right? It's category and class. It's not type. So as long as you have currency in a glider, you can't have currency in an airplane and let it carry over to gliders. You have to have currency in the glider in order to act as pilot in command. And you are the pilot in command in a situation where you're instructing a student pilot. You have to maintain your 90-day currency of 3 takeoffs and landings each 90 days. So it's like I said, I know that in the past it's been kind of misinterpreted that as long as you're the pilot in command or considered to be the pilot in command as an instructor, that counts for your 3 takeoffs and landings, which it does not. Does that adequately cover it, you think, Rich?
Yeah, the big thing is that 6157 reclassified who you're carrying. It's no longer a passenger, but if you have a person on the aircraft, in the aircraft with you, then you must be 6157 current.
Right. Yeah, so it doesn't matter whether it's a quote unquote passenger or a pilot who's not qualified, whether a student pilot or a transition pilot or somebody who's not qualified to. If you have another person in the aircraft and you're the pilot in command, you have to maintain your 3 takeoffs and landings every 90 days. So here's a few teaching tips from veteran instructors. Pre-flight and post-flight inspections. We want to make sure that we're teaching glider assembly, use of the checklist in the manual to assemble the sailplane. I get on check rides and people are a little bit, well, either they haven't done it, and I'm not saying that. I think it's good technique from an instructor standpoint that you actually have a student, do an assembly or disassembly and or at least assist in one. Um, I know that we can't take apart the training gliders and put them all together all the time, but there should be some time devoted toward actual hands-on glider assembly or disassembly, or usually there's other gliders at your field that you could ask the owner of the glider if you wouldn't mind, he or she wouldn't mind you and your student observing, and you can make comments to your student about what they're doing, not interfering. You don't want to interfere with their assembly or disassembly, but you can make comments to your student about how they're practicing the assembly or disassembly procedure. So, and then also the critical assembly and positive control checks after you're completed. The critical assembly check is basically having another knowledgeable pilot look over the sailplane after the sailplane is assembled and making sure that the critical pieces are in place. I know my father was years and years ago was teaching one of our club members. We had a Schweitzer 123, and he was going to go cross country in it. And one of the requirements was is that they take it apart and put it on the trailer before they go cross country. So my dad said they were in the process of disassembling the wings on the 123, and he got to the point where he was looking in at going to show him where the main wing pins were, and they weren't there. And he thought, well, maybe, did you already disassemble that? Did you already pull those main wing pins out? He says, no, I haven't touched it. Well, long story short, the main wing pins had not been installed. They were in the pocket, the side pocket of the glider. And the only pins that were installed that were holding the wings physically onto the glider were the rear spar attach pins. And the main wing spar was kind of locked in. It had a kind of a box structure in the fuselage that it locked into. But and I can't remember for sure, but I think possibly the ends of the wing spars went across and were locked together as well. But the main wing pins were not installed in that glider, and they don't really know how long it had been since it had flown. But they think it had flown at least a few times like that. Not too good. And then a positive control check just to make sure that the controls are hooked up properly. Even gliders that hook up automatically, I have seen firsthand experience. ASW 27s, and there's probably others, where if you don't be real careful about getting that the automatic hookup uh, arm in the pocket correctly, you can actually get it to where the ailerons won't work. I mean, the ailerons, the glider's assembled, but that ball that sits on the arm is not in the pocket, and the ailerons are locked in position, and the stick doesn't move. I mean, if you do a pre-flight check with the stick, you'll find that out. But I remember there was somebody uh, one time they were actually out all the way to the flight line, and they were getting ready to do a control check, and the ailerons were locked. They could not move them, and it was because of that phenomenon where the control arm from the wing had not positively locked into the pocket that it was supposed to. So very important to train those kinds of things. Identifying hazards on the field, runway incursions during taxi and staging. I know Bert and I have observed a few times and talked to, unfortunately, some glider operations post-accident where they actually had an accident because of a runway incursion. And so it's really important. We kind of are a little bit lax about that, to be quite honest, in glider operations. We shouldn't be, but to be quite honest, I feel like we're kind of lax about that. And I know that Bert and I, when we've been doing some uh, reviews of a glider's operation and things like that, threat surveys, we notice some of the the way that the operation is lax in runway incursion avoidance. So golf carts on the runway when they shouldn't be, pedestrians on the runway crossing the runway when they shouldn't be. They're not escorted properly. Even staging a glider on the runway when another glider or airplane is landing. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to have runway incursions, and those are hazards that are avoidable if you just take your time. And there's nothing that dictates that you have to, hurry the operation, so to speak. And you must maintain a good awareness of, especially if you have guests on the field, of where they're at and what they're doing, and whether they're in an area where Again, we've had accidents over the years of people standing too close to the runway edge, taking a picture and getting hit. And it's happened more than once. I mean, there's no good excuse for things like that. So we really have to work hard at trying to identify hazards on the field, especially when it comes to runway incursion type hazards. Flying out of an uncontrolled field or even a towered controlled field. So the two different animals, you're maybe a little more likely to fly out of a tower controlled field in a pure glider or in a motor glider than you are a pure glider. I'm not saying that that's 100% true, but either way, if you're in a controlled field, you've got to coordinate with the control tower for your takeoffs and landings. In an uncontrolled field, it's a little different, but it doesn't relieve you of the responsibility for making sure you have a safe operation. Just because you make the radio calls that you're supposed to for taxi or taking position in the runway, or you're in the pattern for landing and you're calling out your different positions in the pattern. I can tell you, and I'm sure Bert's seen this too, and other pilot examiners have seen this too, that they come into the airport and they are still on the same frequency of the airport that they took off on. And so they're making all their radio calls, but they're on the wrong frequency. So nobody can hear them. So they might just as well be not making any radio calls at all. And it brings up a good point, where if you're in an uncontrolled airfield and you're listening diligently on the radio and trying to, get a situational awareness, you got to remember that other aircraft could be operating out of the same field, and they don't have a radio, or as I just mentioned, they're on the wrong frequency, or there's all kinds of scenarios where they don't have to have a radio. They don't have to, even if they have a radio, they don't have to talk on it. And so you want to be sure that you're just not blindly making radio calls and thinking that you're covered, so to speak. You still need to be looking out, and you still need to be training, even more so than at a controlled field, or at least equally as much as you would be at a controlled field or the control tower, because you're responsible for separation as well. And there's nobody else looking over your shoulder for that responsibility. We have distractions, excuse me, that can cause us to not be mindful of some of the things that we should be mindful of as when we're operating. We talk about the sterile cockpit concept, but sometimes people don't really fully understand it. But basically, in a sailplane, the most important critical time would be when you're either taking off and in the general vicinity of the airport, or landing and in the vicinity of the airport, whether it's in a pattern or you're landing straight in or whatever. You need to make sure that you're not distracted by outside things, or even your passengers. If they're trying to ask you about this or about that, you need to ask them to just politely hey, if you see any conflicting traffic, please point it out to me. But otherwise, let's keep the chit chat to a minimum. So some of the risks involved during takeoff. I put on there kiting. I think that's really a strong risk that we have seen, and it's not only a risk for us in the glider, but it's a risk for the tow plane. It's probably more of it is more of a risk for the tow plane pilot than it is for us. I mean, if we start kiting, we can release in the glider and probably safely land from 200 or 300 feet off the ground. But if the tow plane If you're pulling the tow plane's tail up and they're either unable to release or they decide not to release until it's too late, uh, it's a real hazard. And we've had accidents, fatal accidents, where the tow plane cannot recover before they hit the ground. And so it's kiting is really a something on the takeoff, a risk on takeoff that we really have to pay attention to and be very mindful of, and make sure that our students are very mindful of it as well, because it can lead to some catastrophic events. So risks associated with approaches and landings. And so I'll talk just about, I mean, there's all kinds of risks, but we'll talk about a few of them. Off airport landings. You know, are you prepared to make an off airport landing? Have you thought about what altitudes that you want to stop soaring at and start landing at? You know, a good friend of mine, he the way he handles that is when he puts the landing gear down on his sailplane, it kind of helps him to shift his focus on stopping the soaring and starting the approach and landing phase. You know, looking for obstacles, looking at the field that he's picked out to land in. Try to put your mindset on the fact that, hey, I'm gonna make a landing in an off airport situation. Unstabilized approaches. You know, it's really important that we try to stabilize, especially on final approach. You know, in airplanes, we try to stabilize at a little higher altitudes, you know, probably 500 feet, sometimes even 1,000 feet if we were in a IFR situation, instrument situation. But even VFR, we want to be stabilized by 500 feet in an airplane. And the glider flying handbook has taken that out, but the previous glider flying handbooks have that we should be stabilized by 200 feet. You know, the Soaring Safety Foundation would suggest that that would be an absolute minimum time when you'd be stabilized. And what does that mean? Well, you want to be on the glide path that'll bring you to the field. You want to be at the pitch attitude that maintains a constant airspeed, and you want to have an appropriate amount of drag or dive brakes deployed so that you can control your glide path. If you're flat on a flat glide path without any dive brakes open, well, that's not really a stabilized approach, because if you run into some wind gradient effect, like that's on here too, you could end up short of the runway if you're on a maximum glide to the on final approach there to the runway. So keep that in mind. You know, the wind gradient effect, and I know this. You know, we had discussions about this almost at every flight instructor course, to be quite honest, about what is the wind gradient effect. And the wind gradient effect will always make you fall short. That's counterintuitive of what you might think, but if you come down into lessening headwind, the you might intuitively think, well, I'll go farther, but that's not true. You'll actually lose performance and land short of your intended point of touchdown. So, you know, I think contributory to the most recent accident up in Toronto, I think could have been a strong wind gradient effect. You know, as the airplane was approaching, the sink rate started increasing when they were close to the ground. And I think personally that it's possible that the wind gradient effect could have affected the sink rate of that aircraft. And, you know, in the vernacular of airline pilots, they call it a sinker without really knowing what it is. And I've talked to numerous airline pilots over the years who don't really understand the wind gradient effect, and they just call it a sinker. And if you, but it's not a downdraft. It's just a lessening of the headwind as you come down closer to the ground. It's something that you know, the Joy of Soaring actually had a pretty good illustration of that years ago. We've kind of not talked about it as much in some of the current training manuals, but they still should be talked about because it can you know, get you, and you need to carry extra speed to fly through that wind gradient effect. So Same way at CRJ, they needed to be carrying extra speed. I have a feeling that when a pilot went to flare, they were in such a high descent rate that and slower speed that they had already sacrificed some of their speed, and when they went to flare, they found that they couldn't. And that's the same thing that happens in a glider. You go to flare, you increase your sink rate during the approach, and you go to flare and you just can't. So you have a hard landing. So it's something to consider. And like I said, it can bring down big airplanes just as easy as it can bring down gliders. So let's practice a paved risk analysis. And here's the scenario. Nancy, a private glider pilot with 100 hours experience, has just purchased a new glider. He brings it to the field after driving all night and not getting much sleep because the forecast calls for excellent lift. She wants you, the flight instructor, to give her a quick cockpit check for insurance purposes so she could go fly. Now, I'm going to ask our panel to do a little analysis on this, and you as well, people in the audience, type in some of your answers and what you think Nancy should do. First of all, what do you think about this situation? Do you think it's a good situation, a bad situation, something that deserves further attention? If you were the flight instructor who is being asked to give a quick cockpit checkout for insurance purposes, would you do that or would you not do that, and why? And if you wouldn't, or if you would or you wouldn't, what would you advise Nancy to do? So if you want to write in a few comments, and we'll see if our panel members can bring in your ideas into the discussion as well. So I open it up to the floor to our panel members and/or the people who are on here who want to participate by writing a comment.
Well, my wife is a student pilot and her name is Nancy.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay.
She takes it seriously,
I'm sure she does.
as do I.
So what do you think about this situation, Bert?
Well, I've been in this situation many times. You're in soaring for 50 years and have a commercial soaring operation, people bringing their gliders to us. It's a bad situation. It's a setup. Then again, the people, man or woman, can be very demanding. Hey, I just got this thing, and you advertise you can give me a tow, and you've got to have your own, be able to push back. You don't want to tow somebody who could kill your tow pilot on the first tow. Cockpit checks, I've done a few. If I'm not really familiar with the glider, and I've flown dozens of types, I'll find someone who is, or ask them before they come here at their home glider port, get that insurance check. I am not happy when I teach instructors, be careful when you take that pen towards someone's logbook and your name goes in that. So be qualified to give a quick, well, there ain't no such thing as quick. Like my dad used to say, slow down, boy, we ain't flying the mail here. So cockpit check, I'd like to know that they've already got one. And then I'd be happy to go over the flight manual with them. And it's not going to be quick. Not getting much sleep, driving all night, dehydrated, tired, undernourished. That comes with driving all night. Ask me how I know. Dehydration, and especially where I fly at 5,000 feet field elevation, 7,000 foot density altitude typical, is a very important thing.
So those are all pilot things that you've talking about so far.
Yeah.
Whether they're familiar with it, whether they got enough sleep, or whether they're dehydrated or not. What about the aircraft?
So,
Well, I want to see the flight manual, of course, and make sure they have read it as well. It's not still in the plastic sleeve that comes with a brand new guide. Rich?
well, I was just going to say that the pilot issue also brings up the I'm safe checklist as a good way to do the evaluation. A lot of the comments online are also making this point about fatigue and other issues with the pilot's mental state and physical state to actually go fly. So they're all recommending don't fly. You could certainly put it together. For the aircraft, it's probably got some kind of flight computer. And does she know how to use that? Does she know how to program it? Is the database current? She got the local database? Is this a new glider or a brand new glider or new to her? What's her experience in other gliders and other aircraft? Is she jumping into something that's got a CG hook instead, and everything she's done before has been an arrow tow hook? Those are some of the aircraft issues that, as Bert has also mentioned, going through how does it go together? How does it come apart? Is it manual control hookups, automatic control hookups? You just went through a very nice discussion about making sure that it's assembled properly, positive control checks, critical control assembly checks. All these things go towards the aircraft, its instrumentation, and then its performance characteristics. How does it compare with what she's flown before? Stepping down, if this is she's used to flying modern fiberglass glass, and this is a 126. That's going to be a big jump, just as much as going from the 126 to a new glass glider.
Good point.
And I, a comment that I think of mainly because I'm a maintenance guy is what is the current status? I mean, is this aircraft even airworthy? Does it have a current annual inspection? Does it have the proper paperwork, registration? And, she just bought it. Did she fill out a new registration and submit it in the mail and have a temporary registration? Did she check and make sure the airworthiness certificate, or if it's a experimental sailplane, does it have a current, not annual, but condition inspection?
And
So
a program leader.
And a program later. That's right. So it's, there's things to think about other than just throwing the glider together and go to fly. So as far as the maintenance is concerned.
It's weight and balance. When was the last time it was weighed? Is it actually meeting the requirements that you'd expect?
Right.
She may be a very good pilot too.
Yeah, and these are all things that, we as instructors sometimes don't think about. As Bert mentioned, you can't do a quick cockpit check. There's a lot of things that the pilot, need to be aware of, and maybe they've taken some things for granted, flying in their club or something like that, that somebody else is taking care of the maintenance and somebody else is making sure all the registration certificates and things like that are current. Now it's going to be her responsibility to make sure all those things are checked and double checked. So it's, the airplane could be a problem as well.
It seems like a major underlying problem here is that she wants to do this. I mean, for the new owner pilot with only 100 hours to show up at the field expecting to fly after having driven all night without any sleep is pretty nuts. So I would think that one of the things that a good instructor would say, no, we're not going to do a sign off. In fact, let's talk about the decision making that you've made, asking me to give you a sign off today.
Yeah, good point, Ken. Real good point.
I see an environmental situation. Forecast calls for excellent lift. Out here, that means shifting winds, gusts, dust devils. It's going to be very dynamic on tow and on landing. And excellent lift. I'd give it a day and go over these things and say, tomorrow, if it's good lift today, it'll probably be good lift tomorrow. And also our demeanor as instructors, instead of coming at the pilot and saying, well, you can't do this, and have you done that, and all that. We need to phrase it in a nice way. Let's go over some important things, and not that you missed. It's just you might not have thought about, and take it slow. I've had to do this. So, and now tomorrow you can fly. Um,
Yeah, and the external pressure is she's thinking that today's going to be the last day that they're ever going to have excellent lift, right?
yeah.
Good, all good points, Bert. Thank you.
I've seen too many like this.
Well, yeah, and I've seen my share of them as well. As I'm sure those of you who are out there are experienced instructors. I'm sure you've seen that as well. But if you're going to be if you're looking to be an instructor, think about exactly what you want to how you want to handle this situation. It may be somewhat obvious, but like Bert says, you have to be somewhat diplomatic about it. I mean, you don't want to you want to encourage this new owner of their sailplane that this is a great deal. You're going to be able to fly this when you want to and have a lot of enjoyable and pleasurable soaring hours in it. But you can't get off on the wrong foot to begin with, and I think it's really important to think about that. Any other comments? We'll go to the next scenario if
Yeah,
not.
before you do, one of the things you can do as an instructor is give this to your pre-solo students as a scenario, walk through this with them, and then when they wind up in this situation, they will be more like Ken had suggested, that they'll be prepared to say, I'm not going to fly this the first day I get it. I'm going to be all set up to figure out what I need to know, and my instructor is going to help me do all those things. So
Yeah.
instead of springing it on them when they show up, they're all prepared for the fact that this is what's going to happen when they show up with a new glider that day.
Good point, Rich. Good point. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next scenario here and see what scenario number 2. Again, think about analyzing this with using the PAVE checklist. So pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. You've been flying with Bob, an airplane transition pilot, for the last 20 dual flights, and he thinks he's ready for solo flight and wants you to sign him off in the ASK-21. You have observed a tendency for Bob to PIO the glider during landing due to an erratic use of the dive brakes. The wind conditions are a direct crosswind, 10 to 15 knots. What would you do? So here's a couple of interesting questions that you might want to entertain, and we'll talk about each one of them. First of all, what would you do if you've observed Bob having erratic landings and causing a PIO? What would be your concern? Why don't you type in some of your concerns, and either Rich or somebody will look at that and we'll talk about it.
Here, I'm pretty sure the max demonstrated crosswind component for an ASK-21 is, I think this
Only in Europe, Bert. Only in Europe.
Only in Europe. Okay.
Well, I think that's is something, I think Bert brings up a good point that it's not a requirement in the United States, but it's certainly something that we want to consider as to, whether you want to take that risk or not.
Yep.
Regarding the pre-solo written test, it's not required, but I make them take it.
Okay, right. So if it is not required, I would agree with you, but yet I've, as an examiner, and I'm sure Bert maybe could back me up on this too, when I give a flight instructor a test, oral, and we talk about this, there are numerous flight instructors who think it is required because it's required by 6187. So is that what you're that what you're endorsing this person for? Solo flight in accordance with 6187? Or is it some other type of endorsement that you
Well, I think
need
so
to
much
do?
of the FARs are minimum requirements. And I just feel an obligation to make sure that in a way it tests myself. Have I taught them everything about as much as I can? And maybe the pre-solo written test is a way to test whether I've covered everything. You know, when you send someone solo, where they're already an airplane pilot, you run their wing and then you look at it and you're wondering, did I teach them everything? I've forgotten. So, and the PIO, I just tell people don't play trombone close to the ground with the dive brakes. Use them on final. At some point, you've got to stop big motions on the erratic use of the dive brakes, as it says here.
Yeah, I know I've encountered that with the ASK-21 in particular. If people can get into some pretty severe PIOs with trying to modulate the dive brakes in an erratic manner, especially close to the ground, as Bert says. As far as the legally, you're right. You don't need a pre-solo written test because they're not under the 6187 rules for solo flight. But I agree with Bert. It's not a bad idea to give them a pre-solo written test so that you know that they're knowledgeable about the things that they need to be knowledgeable about. I mean, is this person might not even be current in an airplane, so you want to make sure that that their currency knowledge, whether it's FARs or some other knowledge, that is make sure it's current.
So I
So
think they need to have a current flight review in order to solo if they're a transition pilot. So they have a current BFR, or used to be BFR.
you're absolutely correct, Ken, and that's another good point, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's absolutely correct. There is a letter of understanding from the FAA's legal department, that letter of interpretation that says they have to have a current. They have to meet 6156, which is the flight review requirement. However they meet it is up to them, but they have to be current in 6156. That's correct.
In the category that they hold. A lot of it's just people told me, oh, I'll just do it in your glider. No, you're not glider rated yet. So
Yeah.
well,
They can't do a flight review in a glider, but they can comply with the 6156 by doing a wings course. And so but because the wings course does not require that they are current and qualified, or that they're rated in the aircraft. So if you read that portion of the regulation under 6156, and you're talking about the wings courses, it doesn't say that you have to be rated in the glider. And I'm talking about the FARs, not saying it. So, and the FARs is what is the rule. The rule is the FARs, not the advisory circular. So, how about a launch endorsement? Do they have to have a launch endorsement before they can fly solo in the glider? Or is that just something that they have to have if they have an actual certificate, a private pilot certificate in a glider? So when do they have to have that launch endorsement?
When they're going to launch.
Yeah, whether it's solo, anytime that they are sole manipulator of the controls or pilot in command, whether it's in solo flight or in as a pilot or in solo flight, they have to have the launch endorsement under 6131. So, and how are you going to under what regulation are you going to sign this person off? And what training is required before you can actually make that endorsement? You know, you're putting your certificate on the line. You're putting your signature on that line that says this person is qualified for soloing. And Bert made that point earlier. So what training do you have? First of all, what training do they have to have before you can make that endorsement?
All the training that's listed for their certificate in the appropriate FAR in report 61 for whatever subpart they're looking at to get a rating in.
Yeah, that's kind of a gotcha because not everybody, knows that. So to be quite honest, again, I'm sure that Bert and I have both seen this during initial flight instructor check rides. But basically, they don't have 6187 is totally out of the picture. Okay, you're not training them in accordance with 6187 because 6187 is the student pilot regulation, and they're not a student pilot. They're wanting to be a soloing in a aircraft for which they are not rated, and that comes under 6131 Delta 2. Okay, and so if you read that part of the regulation, it's just as Rich suggests, is that you have to be trained in all the things that you need to know to actually obtain the rating in that at that level of certificate. In other words, if you're a private airplane pilot and you want to uh, be a private glider pilot eventually, you have to have all the training necessary in 61 10 trying to pull this out.
107, 109.
105 and 107, right? 105 is the knowledge. You have to be knowledgeable about all the 105 pieces, and 109 is the flight proficiency, and so and the 107 is where you get to know, the 107 talks about areas of operation, okay, and they're pretty generic. It says something like pre-flight. Well, that doesn't mean the pre-flight of the airplane. That means pre-flight procedures. And where you go to find out what those pre-flight procedures are is you go to the ACS or the PTS. In the case of a glider, you go to the PTS to see what pre-flight procedures you have to train them in. In essence, before you can put your signature on the line for 6131 Delta 2, you've got to make sure that they've been trained in accordance with the areas of operation which are in the PTS in the case of a glider, whether it's private or commercial pilot. It's a lot. You can't just say right in their logbook, okay to solo, and let it be at that. There's a lot of things that you're required as a flight instructor to go over before you can make your signature. And it's right there in 6131 Delta 2. It says it, knowledge and areas of operation in accordance with that level of pilot certificate. So, and, as we have talked about over the years, I'm sure many instructors who have looked at this and our current instructors know that this is not an endorsement that expires unless you make it expire. Yep. The regulations make the student pilot solo endorsement expire. You have to have that solo endorsement every 90 days. But it's not in the regulation, the 6131 Delta 2 regulation that makes that endorsement expire. So in other words, if you make that endorsement in their logbook and you don't put an expiration date on it, they can go fly basically anywhere in the country under that endorsement for as long as they want to. So we at the Soaring Safety Foundation, and I personally, would recommend that you put some kind of limitation on those endorsements. Whether it's, a lot of times what I would do is I would put an endorsement, since our glider flying around the Chicago area would end, say, mid-November, I'd put a restriction that endorsement would end at the end of November. So if they had wanted to fly solo in a glider after November 30th of that particular year, then they'd have to get re-endorsed. But that's personal preference. But I would highly recommend that you put some kind of expiration date on that endorsement, even though you're not legally required to.
And if you use the Soaring Safety Foundation SSA pilot logbook, you have that comment. We have that comment after that endorsement. This is a lifetime endorsement unless, and you're certainly allowed to do it. And I have people come to me. We don't have a club, but come here to get their fast track training, they call it, which is not that fast. And, oh, you're leaving day after tomorrow? That's all I'm going to sign off for, because my signature follows them back to their club. It's important that instructors understand their responsibility when you put your signature in someone's logbook. And I was just at the DPE recurrent training course for my FISDO, and they are emphasizing signatures must be legible. The flight instructor signatures must be legible. So if you use the SSA, SSF logbook, there's a space where you can print your name after your artistic signature.
Thanks, Bert. That's correct. I'm going to my FAA DPE meeting on Friday, so I'll be all up to speed, just like you are. But yeah, it's I can't overstate, and I'm sure Bert can't overstate, and I know Rich can't overstate the importance of knowing what your level of responsibility is, because you don't want that signature being in somebody's logbook and not have done an adequate job in preparing them for the training that you've done for them. So really know what you're signing off on, and make sure that you've done your due diligence before you make those endorsements.
So the consensus from the community seemed to be that Bob did not understand how to use the die brakes effectively, which is why he's being so erratic. That he doesn't get to drive the train, deciding when he gets to solo or not. That's the CFI responsibility. And the crosswinds are really an issue that you need to really consider.
Well, thanks for those comments from the audience, Rich. I appreciate you passing them along, and I think that those are all very valid comments. And so thank you for enriching this session by making those comments and making sure that people are aware of that as well. I got one more scenario here to talk about. Let me go to the next one. Like my computer is locked up. Hang on a second here. There we go. Scenario number 3. Sam, a student pilot, arrives at the field in an angry state of mind. He yells at the office personnel because the glider he wants to fly is not immediately available. Then he's informed that you, the instructor, are on your lunch break and will not be ready for another 30 minutes. When you do arrive, he demands that you and he go fly without a pre-flight briefing or a glider inspection. How would you handle this situation? What would you do? And how would you analyze Bob's readiness to fly?
Should be Sam's readiness to fly.
Sam, oh yeah. Switched it. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Sam's readiness to fly. So think about it in the PAVE checklist. The pilot, is the pilot ready? The aircraft. That's a little bit of a situation to some extent. The environment, what kind of things can you think about the environment, and the external pressures. So if you want to write your comments there, and then Rich or somebody can look at them. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask the panel members to talk.
We'll take physical confrontation off the table.
Okay.
We're here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Quoting Bob, because we've got Sam at the beginning and Bob.
Yeah, I know. I messed
Okay.
that up.
Okay.
My apologies.
I'm going to quote Bob Wander. I wish he was here to say that. I hear how much I have learned from him and Derek Biggett and such. Bob Wander once said, "In most businesses, the customer is always right. In aviation, the customer is not always right." And this is going to be a calm sit down, saying, you can't be angry. I have to admit, with all the pressures and issues and of insurance and taxes and airport managers, sometimes just going up in the glider, you forget all that because you're so focused on the art and science and the beauty of soaring. Don't you agree? I mean, flying sometimes perfect, but this is not the situation here. We're going to sit down and talk. And I'm on my lunch break because if I don't eat lunch and just have some cheese crackers that afternoon, I may not be 100%. So I always have a peanut butter and jelly at lunch. All the food groups.
Yep. It's important. I agree. Nourishment is important, and that's one of the I am safe parts of the making sure that the pilots and the instructor in this case is ready to fly. Yeah. Any other comments from the gallery?
Thank you.
Yeah, so far nobody's willing to fly with them. They want to figure out ways to try to get him to realize that this is not a situation that's conducive to learning, that he seems to be ignoring a lot of good rules and regulations, checklists, no briefings, no pre-flight, just jump in the aircraft and go. I don't see anybody here who's saying, we can work this out in the air. So Sam's grounded for the rest of the universe, length of the universe.
Yeah, well, we want to make sure that especially if he's a student pilot, that he understands the importance of not being distracted by outside things that he has no control over. It's sometimes it just have to sit back and relax, because it will, as Rich mentioned, it will affect your ability to fly the aircraft safely. And so those distractions are really important. There's external pressures, whether it's you've got to get this lesson done so that you can get home for dinner or whatever. You need to mitigate some of those external pressures and not be under such stress that you probably are not going to do very well. And I've seen that, as my glider school. I'm sure again, Bert in his glider school, he's seen that as well, and Rich in his club, or Ken in his club. When somebody comes to the field and they're upset, it's usually not a good scenario for anybody. And so I think it's really important that you mitigate that a little bit and try to make sure that the situation is diffused before they even consider going to fly, and make sure you do a thorough pre-flight briefing and a pre-flight inspection of the glider as well.
You could probably get a lot of this done by taking him off to the side and having him help you wash the glider while you talk about the PAVE and I'm safe acronyms.
Yeah.
Let him work off his steam while he's doing something useful.
That's a good idea, Ken. It's also taking him aside kind of diffuses the situation where he's not going to be embarrassed in front of his peers and things like that, so that you don't want to get into an argument with him about it, or, as Rich said, a physical confrontation, because that's a no-win situation for everybody, the instructor and and the student as well. So, I mean, you really need to try to diffuse the situation and make sure that they, and that's an excellent, comment, Ken, distract them by, hey, let's go do this or let's go do that, and get them to be thinking about something else, and then get back to the situation of whether you're going to go fly or not. So, excellent idea, Ken. So yeah, this is obviously, as an experienced instructor, I'm sure that some of you have seen situations like this, and again, it just doesn't usually pay to let that go without diffusing the situation and allowing people to vent their feelings. That's fine, but you need to calm down and put yourself in a frame of mind that's going to allow you to have a safe adventure and a safe flying adventure. So, okay, so let's talk about a summary of this lesson: risk management and accident causality. It's been shown. Rich has, I know, over the years at our FERCs, he shows the accident that we have for the previous year, and risk management is usually a big part of many of the accidents. It's not aircraft, being breaking apart in midair or anything like that. It's usually because they haven't managed their risks, whether it's the risk of proper assembly without a good positive control check, whether it's the risk of flying when you're not capable of flying, you haven't done the I'm safe checklist, or you've avoided a couple of the things on the I'm safe checklist, items on the I'm safe checklist, and because you know that you wouldn't be going flying that day. We've talked about managing the teaching, risk management teaching techniques by phase of instruction, whether you're a student pilot or a private pilot or transition pilot, what phase are you in your instruction. We talked about some of the techniques that experienced instructors do to manage risk during flight instruction, and we talked about using the PAVE checklist to help identify and mitigate those risks that you might encounter during a normal flight instruction type of scenario. Again, this is basically the same resources that we have had in the past. I don't know, if you took that glider pilots ground school with Dave Seymour last week, I know we took a week off. Why don't you just indicate it with a comment or something like that? I'm just kind of curious as to how many people might have attended that glider pilot ground school with Dave and last week, as to in preparation for your knowledge test. So before you have to, his next evening class would be April 15, 16, and 17. So. And here's the future schedule for me and you, if you so choose to attend. This is today, February 19th. When I get back from the seniors, the first one I'm going to do is Wednesday, March 26th. And we'll talk about Chapter 2, the human behavior. April 2nd and April 9th, we're going to talk about the learning process. It's kind of a lengthy chapter, and so I've broken it down into two different sessions so that we can understand the learning process a little more effectively. So, and the April 16th will be Chapter 4, effective communication. April 23rd, Chapter 5, the teaching process. And April 30th, Chapter 6, assessment. And that'll pretty much get us through the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. We'll be incorporating chapter 1, the risk management and single pilot resource management throughout the course of instruction. I incorporated a little bit today with that as well when talking about the PAVE checklist. So we'll continue to incorporate the chapter 1, the risk management and single pilot resource management, as we move through it, the rest of the chapters as well. And so here's some of the references that we use. And do we have any questions other than what we've already talked about?
4 people responded that they took the ground school course.
Four?
Yes.
Okay, good. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear you're getting that knowledge test, up to speed on the knowledge test, and you're gonna go take it. That's a great start. I'd be interested to know what you thought about it. If you want to write a comment or something like that, we'll try to look at the comments before we leave here. So
There were more than 100 people on the class, it says.
there was more than 100 people in the class?
At the ground school class.
Wow. Excellent. That's really a credit to Dave. I mean, he works hard at that, and I think that he's had a pretty successful go of it over the years. I know that he boasts that you'll pass, and I think that that's it doesn't necessarily give you an in-depth knowledge about of the material, but at least it gets you to the point where you've got some basic knowledge about the material, and you can go and then get more in-depth knowledge with further one-on-one instruction with a flight instructor in preparation for your practical tests. So I'm going to talk about the crosswind landing video here. We're going to show that. And it's just a short little Condor training video that Scott Manley made up for the Soaring Safety Foundation. And we're just going to, it doesn't have any audio, so you'll have to read what it says. And we'll talk about it here in a few minutes. So that's an important thing. Turn through the runway heading and crab into the wind. We want to transition to the side slip for landing.
Weather vane.
A little bit of weather vaning there at the very last. So here's what it looks like from the cockpit. Thanks to Scott for putting this together for the Soaring Safety Foundation.
I like the fairly steep turn, base turn to final. I have a problem with airplane pilots saying they were taught never to make steep turns, make shallow turns in the pattern. And I like that condor where it shows an affirmative turn. My dad used to say, get the turn over with, and then we could get on with landing. So that was a good demonstration of the turn.
So this clip has an instructor guide to it, and I'll just kind of let you read through it very quickly here. It's actually on 3 different slides because it's pretty extensive, but it gives you the instructor some ideas about what to discuss when you're doing this. And it shows Scott's Manley's idea that simulation is really helpful because it allows you to show or actually demonstrate now if you have an actual simulator in your club or your commercial operation, the fly. It allows you to do multiple approaches and landings under differing conditions, differing scenarios, and so it can be very beneficial to the training process. And discussion about why to start the turn early, because you got a faster ground speed on base leg, right? If the pilot doesn't start the turn on time, where will they end up? If they start the pilot turn too late, they'll be past the runway center line by the time they get on final approach. What actions can the pilot take if the turn is started too early or too late? As Bert mentioned, a nice affirmative turn. You want to make sure that, you judge it carefully. And if you start it a little bit too early, you can always shallow the bank out and let the wind drift you over to the center line of the runway before you apply the side slip. But if you start it too late, that's a recipe for disaster, in that, generally speaking, not 100%, but it happens a lot where people tend to use too much rudder, in other words, skid the turn to final. And so you want to be very cognizant of that and do a thorough briefing, especially if you have a reasonably strong crosswind. Do a thorough briefing about how that crosswind's going to affect that turn from base leg to final, besides the fact how it affects on downwind and other places in the pattern as well. And discuss that ground track on final. Is the glider tracking the runway center line? What control inputs does the pilot make if the glider is right of center line? Well, you're going to have to turn into the wind a little bit more. You have to increase the crab a little bit. What control inputs does the pilot make if the glider is left of the center line? Well, you'd have to take a little bit of the crab out, right? So transition to the crab to the side slate. This is something that I don't think we train enough, because we only have maybe a few seconds to train it there on the approach, and it's something that you can do at altitude. In fact, that's a training maneuver that I like to do. Start at 2,000 feet, find a road that's perpendicular to the runway or perpendicular to the wind, and initially crab into that wind, tracking along that road for do it for, I don't know, 5, 10, maybe 15 seconds, just to demonstrate how the crab works. And then go from the crab to a side slip, transition to the side slip, and show how if you put too much side slip in, you'll actually penetrate into the wind. And if you don't put enough side slip in, you will drift downwind of the center line of that road down below. And then transition from the side slip to a forward slip. And this emphasizes the fact that if you were in a forward slip for some reason, how that transition back to the side slip will look. And so do a little bit of forward slipping for 10 or 15 seconds, and then transition back into a side slip again. It gives your students some practice at those transitions that they don't really get when they're concentrating on the landing, so to speak. And I think that gives you, the instructor, a little bit of a chance to explain it a little bit more carefully, and your students to practice it. If you have a glider simulator, actually this works out pretty well too, in that you could always punch that let's gain 500 feet back and start all over again and do it the other way. So once you get down to the end of the road, you turn around and you come back along the road the opposite direction. You can plan or practice this crosswind techniques from a crab to a side slip to a forward slip in the opposite direction. I remember one time, or more than once, I had a private pilot trying to do a forward slip for the landing, which is a required maneuver in an airplane, and they couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it to save themselves, and obviously that was not going to be an acceptable maneuver for that particular check ride. But when I asked him, well, why did you slip to that direction? Why did you slip away from the wind instead of into the wind? And he says, well, because I've never done a slip the other way. So whose fault is that? That's the fault of the instructor, in my opinion. You need to make sure that they get practice at side slips and forward slips in both directions, left and right. And if you're going to have to do a forward slip, you should always do it into the wind, in my opinion, because on final approach, that is. Maybe on downwind leg, you don't have to do it into the wind, but whatever, it's still not a bad idea to do it into the wind. But on final approach, it's important to do your forward slip into the wind, because the transitions from a forward slip to a side slip is much easier. It's much less demanding. A wing is already down to the correct side into the wind. And so all you got to do is straighten the nose out with the rudder to line the nose up with the center line of the runway to go from a forward slip to a side slip. So it's a much easier transition to make if you side slip into the, or your forward slip rather, into the wind. And then when it comes time to do the side slip, it's an easier transition to make. So. And then here's the last page of things that you might want to consider talking about. Discuss the flare, the touchdown, the ground rollout. As Bert showed or talked about, you can see the weather vaning into the wind, which is if the crosswind is strong enough, you're always going to get some weather vaning at the very last few feet of the landing roll. So you should talk about that, the fact that happens. Should the wings be level, or should one wing be lower than the other? Well, one wing's got to be lower than the other for touchdown, and that's when you get into the side slip. How does the pilot steer on the ground? Obviously with the rudders. Why does the glider turn to the left at the end of the ground roll? And that's the weather vaning effect. Other points to discuss. Factors that go into the decision to use a crab or a side slip. Does the crab affect the sink rate of the glider? Does the side slip affect the sink rate of the glider? Should the yaw string be, where should the yaw string be when the glider is crabbing? Where should the yaw string be when the glider is on a side slip? What controls this rate of sink, or the sink rate of the glider? What controls the airspeed? Pitch attitude controls the airspeed, right? And the rate of sink of the glider is controlled by the dive brakes or the spoilers. What action should the pilot take if the aiming point is moving up in the canopy? That means you're getting low because the aiming point is moving up. If the aiming point is not moving on the canopy, how should you consider? How do you want to look at that? Or if the point is moving down in the canopy, that usually means that you're getting too high because you're coming in over the top of the aiming point. So you need to use more dive brakes in that case. So, it gives a good discussion points that you can use as an instructor after you show that video and talk about these points of discussion with your student. So. And that's the end of the slideshow today. So I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your participation. I hope this has been worthwhile for you. Sorry I'm going to take a a few weeks off here, but I will get back at it as soon as I get back in town, and the next one will be the last week of March. So put it on your calendar. We'll get the invite out to you probably a little closer to when it actually happens, and we'll make sure we get some reminders out to you so that you know it's coming up again. And then my plan right now is to do one every week, every Wednesday, same place, same time, every Wednesday, all through the month of April. And I know that we get busy, as the soaring season starts to heat up. There's contests to be flown. There's other activities to be had, and so I know, if you get busy and you can't make it, well, I understand. It's not necessary that we absolutely do all of these. However, Frank has been very diligent in editing these webinars, and we'll make sure they're posted on the website. So if you miss one and you want to avail yourself of this information, I would highly encourage you to go to the SSA website and avail yourself of that information. We'll try to send out, well, we will send out some information about that so that you know exactly where to go on the SSA website to avail yourself of these webinars. So, are there any other comments from my advisors on the panel?
Good job, cousin.
Thanks, Bert. Yeah. So, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been trying to make these a little more personal in that trying to give you tips that, aren't right out of the book. I think that our advisors and myself, we're trying to give you some ideas and thoughts about from our experiences. And so that I hope that helps you with your preparation if you're preparing to try to go get your glider instructor rating. So thanks for your attention. I'm going to call it a night unless there's any more comments, and we'll see you in about a month.
Nope, just congratulations and thanks.
Okay. Thanks.